Hello and welcome back to the Bright Founders Talk podcast from Temi. Temi is an international software development company that designs, builds, and delivers software for sustainable businesses and promising startups. My name's Chris, and today's guest is someone who has a wealth of experience in the world of tech, a founder of 3 companies, and a CEO of another 2, Oliver Gunasekara. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm great. I'm happy to be here.
Perfect. Lovely to have you. So the first question from our quick fire questions is, what's the best way to kick off the day?
I definitely think with a good breakfast. That's like the most important meal of the day. So that's what I recommend.
Now, what is a good breakfast for you?
I like some fruit. That's often what I do. Oatmeal, if there's some available, a little bit of fruit with it. That goes pretty well.
Oh, sounds very healthy. What's your favorite non-tech way to relax?
I love photography. So I like either capturing pictures or taking pictures. I love wildlife documentaries, landscapes, that type of stuff. I also love movies. I love just being a couch potato sometimes and just, getting immersed in some new area.
Is there any particular movie off the top of your head that you really love? Or
I've always been a science fiction fan, so that's something that I really do enjoy. But recently rewatched Pulp Fiction. That's a classic. I also recently watched Henry V. A bit of Shakespeare with Kenneth Branagh in it. That's a really good movie. So lots of great stuff out there.
Oh, very nice. I'll put it on my list. I haven't seen that one. The final question: what did you want to be when you were growing up?
I didn't really know, to be honest. I knew I wanted to do something with technology. Something like a system administrator was kind of, looking after lots of computers was something that I was interested in. But I honestly didn't know about entrepreneurs, and that was, if I had, that's probably what I would have wanted to do. But growing up in the UK just wasn't a big thing at the time I went to school.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. I wanted to ask you about that because from my experience growing up, it was always play it safe and, get a good job and you'll be happy and that kind of thing. And, maybe some people are, but this whole world of being an entrepreneur was not pushed at all. Is that the same growing up in your case?
Yeah, I mean, there weren't really any role models, right? I mean, we didn't really hear much about, say, Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. They obviously were around. They had created companies. I learned what an entrepreneur was pretty late, probably my mid-20s, I would say, and I wish there had been more emphasis on that going through school, because I've always been very curious. I think curiosity is a very important trait, and, that is kind of what led me to kind of be now an entrepreneur. And I didn't really understand or know about that this existed when I was at school, and that was a big shame.
Yeah, I agree. So going back to school or later studies like university, how did you feel at that time? Did you choose, I think you did engineering, right? Engineering. So did you know what you wanted to do in the future, or were you just following your passion and then you thought, okay, I'll work it out later?
I really had no idea. I was very much an underperformer at school, wasn't very good. I was actually dyslexic, and so I am. And so that kind of held me back from academic performance. And, I left school at 16 and ultimately went to community college. And at that time, I was trying to decide with my mother, do I do a business course or do I do an engineering course? And ultimately, I couldn't really make the decision, but she kind of helped me and said, look, you should do engineering because you can learn the business later, which was absolutely the right decision. So I did a, electrical engineering, BTech course for a couple of years. And then from that, I was able to get into a polytechnic that became a university.
Because I see that you went back to study a few times. Later on, you went back to study business and in another course. I'm not sure, was it management? Or something?
Yeah, I've fortunately I joined a startup that became quite big, and that then allowed me to do some additional courses. But these were relatively short, a few weeks at a time. So I kind of did a mini MBA at Stanford, and I did an entrepreneurial course at MIT, and I did some courses on acquisitions because that was the role that I had moved into in the UK. So, but these were relatively short, a few weeks at a time.
Did you feel like that was something you had to go back and you had to go back to study rather than something you could pick up in the role you were doing, or is it just what you preferred?
I think it was very complimentary. I mean, I don't think I would have the discipline to go and do a multi-year course, especially with getting so involved in kind of work and doing things. But taking a few weeks out, getting a top up, getting, access to some of the best teachers out there and learning case studies was really valuable. So I think it's a great compliment.
Is that something you still do now? Every now and then you sort of dive into a course and come back, you're always learning?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm really doing more academic courses, but I like to read. I probably spend a fair amount of time on LinkedIn. I've kind of dropped off Facebook, but LinkedIn is my social network now, and it's more business related. And it's just amazing the amount of information that's there, that a lot of it is pretty relevant to what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think the internet, like in terms of, well, in my case, the things you can learn on the internet is massive in terms of like YouTube and that kind of thing. I never really realized, and I always thought traditional way is the best, but I think they both have great value. In terms of your first couple of positions as an engineer, how did you get on in those jobs? What was it like?
It was pretty tough, actually. I'm definitely, as I said, not the strongest academic. I'm probably pure intellect. I'm not the highest IQ out there. And so, my first job was a graduate software engineer. I'd done a hardware degree, but they wanted people to kind of work writing low-level firmware to this new hardware that they were building. This was kind of just before desktop publishing was taking over. So this company built their own workstations for laying out newspapers and magazines. And it was great because we got to really write to the metal. There was no OS. It was like the first code that would run. But it was, I did that for about 2 years, and I did okay, but it was tough. Clearly being a full-time software engineer wasn't something that was in my destiny. And then my second job was I moved to being a field applications engineer. And this was for a small semiconductor distributor that would be selling some US chips, and they needed help to design them in, to answer technical questions, to help the customers select the right product. And that I really enjoyed because I would be in the field with the sales guys. I would be the interface between, the field and the factory, effectively the design center in California. And I really enjoyed that. And that worked really well. And then from that job, I got the opportunity to join ARM in end of 1994, and ARM became a rocket ship for the next 13 or so years that I was there.
During your studies, as well as these early jobs, these early positions, they're often a time when you kind of, they shape you in a way, I believe. So I just wondered, is there anything you learned during that time that you still use today, you still incorporate in how you work now?
Definitely having a vision. At ARM, we had an incredible founder. He got knighted, Sir Robin Saxby. He had this incredible vision. We were a small startup, about 60 odd people in total when I joined. And he said, we're going to be the number one standard for 32-bit processors, which was kind of crazy. There was Intel and Motorola and all these giants around, and we were this tiny little company in Cambridge, UK. But he had this vision, and he kind of inspired us, and we believed we could do it, and ultimately we did. So I think having a strong vision and believing is so critical. Another thing is you have to be a bit smart with customers. You obviously need to listen to their input, but they don't always know exactly what they want. And there are often politics. An example here is that our direct customers at ARM all had their own competing product. their own processor. They weren't really excited to buy from us. It was like, well, we've designed our own version. Why should we, throw it away and go and take yours? And if we had purely listened to them, Arm probably wouldn't exist today. But we had this strategy of kind of going to their customers and articulating the benefits that we could bring. And so their customers were the mobile phone manufacturers, the Nokias, the Ericssons, the Motorola's, Siemens. There were a bunch of them. And they were more receptive. They had real problems. We could solve those problems. And they got quite excited. And that ultimately pulled our technology through, despite the direct customers that would have to purchase really didn't want to, but they were really given a choice. And that's a strategy I continue to use today. I mean, you cannot rely on just purely the best technology winning. You have to market it. You have to figure out a way to get it to market, not relying on the fact that it's superior.
In terms of, in your case now, you often, whenever you say start a business now, you dream higher, and then if you fall a little bit shorter, then you're kind of somewhere where you want to be, right?
Yeah,
it's
exactly. And, I would say another lesson, especially when starting businesses and doing things at the early stage, is that startups are really hard, right? Most are not successful. You put a huge amount of effort into them. And so you might as well have a dream, a vision that is really big. Because if you're going to put all that effort into something that's just incremental, why bother? You'll make much more money and have more likelihood of success just joining a company. So if you're going to create something, you need to dream big. And I think now, having lived 18 years in Silicon Valley, in California, that's one of the things that gets baked into you, that there is no limit. You need to be ambitious, you need to be big. And that's something I think the UK could learn a bit from. Really think about how you can be the dominant player, because, apart from Arm, there aren't really many examples of modern technology companies that have become global successes. There probably are a few, but, Silicon Valley has, it has Google, it has Facebook, it has Apple, Microsoft has a big presence here. And these companies had founders that dreamed to being really big. And I think that's one of the limitations, that in the UK, people don't dream big enough.
In terms of, when you talk about Arm, I noticed that there was a crossover with you working at Arm, and also you started a company, MIPI or MIPI?
MIPI Alliance, yeah. So the MIPI Alliance was a non-profit that was started by Arm and Nokia and TI and ST for companies, for the industry. And its goal was to standardize the interfaces between different components in a phone. Prior to MIPI, like, a chip would use one way to talk to a display. All the display vendors would use different ways, and it would be very difficult to mix them up. And display was just one example. Modem would be another. The speakers, the microphone, all of these interfaces were proprietary and unique, and you couldn't mix them. And so Arm, Nokia, TIST came together to create the MIPI Alliance, to create some industry standards so that you could mix. And that organization, I was fortunate. This year they invited me to come to their 20th anniversary in Portugal, and they now have hundreds of members, and just about every chip has multiples of their interfaces. So it's become very, very successful. But it was a non-profit. I was doing it as an Arm employee. Arm was paying my bills as we created this non-profit. But I did do the creation and was on the board for a number of years there.
So for me, it was just fascinating. How did you manage your time between doing that and also, sort of, like you said, a startup, let's say, okay, it was within something else, a branch of something else, but still consumes a lot of energy.
Yeah, but fortunately, Arm kind of gave me decent bandwidth. I was given quite a lot of time to do this because it was seen as strategic for ARM to have this. It obviously enabled the smartphone explosion. It was one of the key enablers that, if you could not mix displays and other components, then the cost and flexibility would have been significantly reduced, and that would have slowed down the adoption of smartphones.
You worked abroad. You worked in Japan, I believe, right? Or was that?
I did, yes.
And obviously now you're living abroad in the US. Do you feel like, or is it something you'd recommend to every aspiring entrepreneur, that they should work abroad and then kind of gain that knowledge of how other industries work?
Yeah, I think it's extremely helpful. I mean, business is global, is international. You learn a lot by just doing business with people, visiting, but you learn more by actually living. So I spent 2.5 years living in Japan from 98 to 2000. And I learned just a huge amount about the Japanese culture, the way to interact. It was also pretty challenging. I mean, we were attempting to do things differently, which was, Japan, especially back at that time, was very hierarchical, very age-related. And so if you wanted to kind of change the way things were done, there was a bit of tension there. But I learned so much and ultimately had so much respect for Japan. And now, 18 years in California, the US is pretty close to the UK, but it's not quite the same. And so I hope I can take the best of both. And so, yeah, I definitely think it's very worthwhile.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think, well, from my experience, I worked in Japan from 2014 to 2018, and it's still very hierarchical. It's still very hard to get your voice heard if you're a bit younger, but anyway, there's good and bad in every way of working. In 2012, you founded another company called Codec, and were there any differences in the way that you started this company? Because I suppose you did it by yourself this time compared to with help from ARM.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, MIPI Alliance, although I was a founder, but I had the cushion of, I was being paid by ARM to kind of do this. And it's not like, if it didn't succeed, it would be game over. So there was a lot of safety nets. But I ultimately left ARM because I got the bug to kind of go back and work at startups. ARM had become public by I think 2008 when I left, and ultimately I really wanted to work back at some smaller companies, and so I had been working at a bunch of startups in the Valley and gaining quite a bit of experience being part of the leadership team of those startups, participating in board meetings, meeting with investors, etc. And so the time came right where, with me and a couple of friends, we ultimately came up with this idea that we could disrupt the way video was processed in the data center. And so that was really the vision for Codec. Codec's a technical term for compression and decompression, and NG for next generation. So the idea was this was the next generation of video compression. And there was a new video standard that was in the process of being ratified and adopted, called H.265, or the High Efficiency Video Codec, HEVC. And so those were really the catalysts. And the three of us kind of started working. It was tough to get funded. I mean, for the first almost 2 years, we failed to raise any money. We were getting pretty close to kind of giving up because none of us had salaries. We were basically living off our savings. We were working out of my converted garage, and the ideas that we were putting forward were not resonating. And ultimately, we did a little pivot to kind of go to the data center, and that started to get some traction. We got our first investor. They wrote the first check, and then that allowed us to build out the team. And ultimately, we had a good exit in 2019. And now if you go to AMD, they will sell you a chip for the data center that has our technology inside it, our encoder technology.
You mentioned the people you started the business with. I'm curious, what did you look for in a co-founder? Like, what kind of partner or attributes does someone need to have to work with you in your case?
I think they have to be complementary. You need people that have different skill sets than yourself, because at the early days, there's just so much to get done that, you want a technical person that can write code and make things happen. You want a business person that can actually go and do deals and position what you're doing and help raise money. I think those are the most important characteristics at the early stages. Later on, you probably want people that have domain experience of the market that you're entering. And if you can get that at the early stage, that's great as well. So I think, most important thing is that you have complementary skills, you're aligned on the mission, and you're in it for the long run, because startups are not a short journey. It averages probably, 7 to more years before something happens. So you got to be there for the highs and the lows, and you've got to have respect, but also, a commitment to get through the challenges and to ultimately make it successful. I would also say that any entrepreneur, all the things that are kind of obvious, you have to be willing to take risks, but grit, perseverance, not giving up, that's really high, because, being an entrepreneur is about dealing with rejection quite frequently. Fundraising is 100 or more people saying no and one person saying yes. So if you're the type of person that will give up after the first 50 people have said no, that's not the right journey for you.
Interesting, yeah. Well, coming on to who you're working, the company that you founded now, Impossible Metals. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do there?
Yeah, so Impossible Metals' mission is to deep sea mining, but in a very responsible way. So we are going after the resources that happen to lie on the deep seabed. And these resources contain metals that we need for the energy transition. So nickel, cobalt, copper, manganese, and some rare earths. And, the energy transition is really a move away from fossil fuels to electrification. But electrification needs metal. You need metal to move the electricity. You need metal to store the electricity in the form of batteries. And there's lots of data out there that we need something like 5 times, 500% more metal over the next couple of decades than we currently produce for mining. If you look at the problems that are around the existing supply chain for getting these metals, the first problem is that it's getting increasingly more difficult, more expensive. It takes longer to permit, and it's challenging whether we can actually extract enough of this metal with traditional mining in the time frame we need. That's the first problem. Second problem is that the ESG, environmental social governance, associated with mining is really quite poor. I can give you 2 examples. If you take the nickel, which is one of the biggest metals used in high-performance batteries for electric vehicles, that nickel probably comes today from Indonesia. And unfortunately, it's a rainforest. So the nickel survives just below the ground in the rainforest. So they literally have to deforest the whole rainforest, destroying the carbon sinks, the biomass, the biodiversity. And then they process it with something called HPAL, high pressure acid leaching, where you use a lot of acid, a lot of energy. So it's really bad for the environment. And that leftover tailings, that toxic waste, gets stored. And then if there's an earthquake, it causes huge damage. So that's Indonesia. If we talk about cobalt, the majority of cobalt comes from Africa, the Congo area. And unfortunately, it's in quite deep, so you have to tunnel. And often there are artisanal miners, children that are teenagers that are used to actually do this mining, getting $1 or $2 a day. And so, from an ESG standpoint, I think there's a better way. And then third and finally, China controls the vast majority of this. They have invested many, many billions of dollars in Africa and Indonesia, and they own these mines, they operate them. and they ultimately control who the output from the mine is sold to. And so if China decides that it doesn't like the UK for some reason, it could turn off all the supply of nickel or cobalt, the majority of the supply. And that's causing governments in the West, especially Europe and the United States, to get very concerned that we need our own supply chain, which is independent. And so those three problems: we don't have enough of this material, it's getting harder to extract it, the costs are challenging, the ESG is really bad, and the fact that China controls it all led me to think about deep sea mining with new underwater robots.
Amazing. Yeah, well, it must be incredibly challenging. It's like something I can't even comprehend. How do you do that? My final question is there any company or CEO that you would like to shadow or to see how they do things for a couple of weeks? Is there anything you'd like to learn?
Yeah, I mean, Elon Musk is a controversial figure, but you can't deny what he's achieved with Tesla and SpaceX. Twitter X, we'll see. But I think I've read his bibliography that recently came out. He clearly has some challenges. He has so-called demon mode, but the speed that he gets his companies to innovate at. Just recently we had the second test launch of the Starship, and the speed of which they are iterating on that design is just phenomenal. And so, I would love to be able to shadow him and see what he's done. I think Richard Branson is also a really impressive individual with all of the companies that he's formed. The fact that he's putting a lot of effort into philanthropic operations, I think, is interesting. And then recently I got to listen to a speech by Arnold Schwarzenegger and watch some of his documentaries. And again, it's fascinating how he's always succeeded and kind of won at what he's done. He was a bodybuilder, then he was an actor, and then he was a politician. I mean, he was the governor of California for two terms. And, as people know, California has the fifth biggest economy on the planet if it was a country. So that's pretty impressive.
That is very impressive. I never really analyzed his career, but yeah, it's true. Brilliant. Well, we wish you all the best with Impossible Metals. It sounds like a very altruistic thing to do, as well as hopefully profitable for yourself. And thanks for your time today.
Yeah, no, happy to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.